John Milne, and I have the pleasure of being the editor-in-chief of the Rangeland Journal. Authors might not think it's such a pleasure. The journal is now in its 37th volume and is an international journal with over 50% of the papers now coming from rangelands other than the outback of Australia. We now publish 6 issues a year, and so the journal is growing in strength. A little bit about the scope of the journal. The scope of the journal is to publish research that contributes to the understanding of the biophysical, social, cultural, economic and policy influences affecting rangeland use and management. And the rangelands are defined broadly and relate to those environments where natural process predominate. To raise awareness of the Rangeland Journal and its scope, we've been, over the last few years, organising lectures on key subject areas in academic and other institutions throughout the world, and we are pleased to be associated with this particular lecture today. As you can appreciate, the scope of the journal means that many of the papers published in the journal relate to the provision of ecosystem services from the rangelands. And it is our pleasure to be associated with this lecture, which relates to a key ecosystem service, the provision of water. And the title of the lecture is Challenges for Sustainable Water Management in the Rangelands. It's going to be given by Professor Stuart Bunn, who is Director of the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University. His major research interests are in the ecology of river and wetland systems, with a particular focus on the science to underpin river management. He's had a number of important roles, which have included being Director of Land and Water Australia, Commissioner of the National Water Commission, and a member and chair of advisory panels for the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Lake Eyre Basin Ministerial Council. And in 2007, he was awarded the Australian Society for Limnology Medal for Outstanding Contribution to Research and Management of Australia's Inland Waters. So it's with great pleasure I ask Professor Bunn to give the Rangeland Journal lecture. Thank you.
I'll start by saying that my career started out working on very, very small forest streams, well removed from the rangelands, and in fact, those are the sorts of streams I started my research career. And it's interesting to note that most freshwater ecology, most of our freshwater science at about that time and leading up until about a decade or so ago was really based on studies of small forest streams, particularly in the temperate parts of the world. And it's only really been in the last 10, 15 years that our understanding of river systems in the more arid parts of the world, and certainly the larger systems of the world, that we've started to really get a better appreciation of how they work. And that's sort of, I think I've been quite fortunate to have the opportunity to spend some of my research career over the last 15 years or so working in the more drier and more interesting parts of the world. And so what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is about some of the characteristics of freshwater systems in the rangelands and certainly the physical and ecological character, the features that make them quite unique, and also share with you some of the key findings from the research that I've been doing over the last few years. And in doing that, I want to explore what some of the current threats are to these sorts of systems and some of the emerging threats to the sustainability, and also some thoughts on how we might go about addressing those particular problems into the future. I always like to start with a sort of global perspective, and it's interesting when we look at the world and think of it as a blue planet. If we rearrange the water of the world like this, and this, as you can see, it's a product produced by the USGS. That's why all the water's in North America. But if you put all the water in the world, the big circle that you see up there is all the water in the oceans rearranged on North America. The smaller dot that you see there is all of the freshwater resources of the world. And that little dot, which you won't be able to see somewhere over Georgia, represents all of the water there is in the rivers and lakes of the world. It's still quite a sizable piece. It's 56 kilometres in diameter, but it certainly shows what a small proportion of the Earth's surface that our rivers and wetlands occupy. And then when you look at what we're doing to those systems around the globe, it's just about on every measure that we look at, measures of water withdrawals, measures of pollution, impacts of inland fishing, or the impacts of invasive species. Those particular threats on freshwater systems are growing, as you can see, growing at a fairly phenomenal rate with no sign of declining. And so freshwater systems around the world we consider to be one of the most threatened systems there are. And some years ago, a group of us working on a global water system project produced this particular article looking at an assessment of global threats to river systems. And we did that by looking at all the available databases at the global scale that look at threats from water resource development or from pollution or from invasive species and so on. And we ranked those threats according to how they would impact on human water security or how they would impact on freshwater biodiversity. And we rated them and ranked them differently depending on whether we're looking at water security threats to humans or to nature. And when you map that at the global scale, one of the first things when you map just the raw data for threat, the threats to human water security and the ones to biodiversity come out looking very similar. The reason these two maps here look quite different, and the top one here is for human water security adjusted for investments, this one's for biodiversity. The reason that they're different is that in the developed world, we've been able to make massive investments, hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of investments in water infrastructure, sanitation and hygiene, and we've been able to address a lot of the human water security problems for our food and for our own well-being by making those investments. That hasn't happened in the developing world, and you see over 3 billion people still live in areas with a very high level of threat. But the interesting thing is when you look at it for nature, we've not made those same sorts of investments. And so whether it's in the developed world or the developing world, we see areas where there's incredibly high threats to biodiversity. Interesting in this study, of course, is that this particular study is done at a fairly coarse spatial scale, and the dryland systems, the rangeland systems in particular in the drylands, don't feature in this analysis because they're not generating sufficient surface runoff, so they're underestimated in that analysis. And that's really a bit of a shame because dryland systems represent about 50% of the world's land mass, of course. Nearly 40% of the world's population live there, and when you look at these systems, they're largely understudied, and particularly from a freshwater point of view, there's very, very little work that's been done compared with studies of small forested systems. And one of the key features of these systems, of course, is they're not only these are dry places, but they're also highly variable. And this is an old piece of work, a relatively old piece of work that was done by Jim Puckridge on an analysis of 51 rivers around the world, looking at measures of their hydrology and in particular focusing on measures of flow variability. This particular plot is a ranked plot based on the summary of all those measures of flow variability. And what it shows quite clearly, I think, is that when you look at all the sort of big rivers around the world, and some of the more commonly known ones are illustrated there, you can see that the rivers that we have in Australia, and there's a couple in there from South Africa, sit at the very high end of that range. And certainly one of the key features of some of our dryland river systems is they are the most unpredictable and variable systems that we deal with on the world. And that, of course, really defines their ecological nature. It defines the way in which these systems operate. And it also poses considerable challenge for people who are wanting to, of course, manage water resources in the drylands. Many of the river systems that we're working on are intermittently flowing. They cease to flow either on an annual basis or in some cases are highly ephemeral and cease to flow for months to years at a time. And what that means, of course, then is that the permanent water in the landscape becomes incredibly important. It becomes incredibly important for human settlement, both since European settlement and well before then. These are important sites for human occupation, but also the permanent water are the places that sustain populations of the fully aquatic animals, and particularly very important places for things that either swim or don't move very far. So some of the, and particularly things that are long-lived, like the example up here of freshwater turtles. So these become very, very important refugia in the landscape, and without them, these sorts of organisms are unable to persist in the landscape. We also know that these permanent water bodies are not just important refuges for aquatic organisms, they're also important places for the terrestrial fauna as well. And I've talked largely here about the permanent freshwater in river systems. We know, of course, in the rangelands in Australia, we have other natural sources of permanent water. The mound springs in particular, another very highly valued permanent water supply, permanent water resource in the rangelands, and indeed are renowned for their very high conservation value. A large number of endemic, very restricted species are found there, and these have very high conservation value. The other thing that I will mention, of course, is that since European settlement, we've really changed the nature of Australia, and particularly changed the nature of the rangelands through the construction of bores for human settlement and for agriculture. And so these systems have really transformed the rangelands, and particularly from a terrestrial perspective, but largely not so from a freshwater perspective. And I don't really want to dwell too much on this particular part of the sort of water story in the rangelands. What I did want to do, though, is focus on some of the key things we know about surface water systems in this part of the world. And much of my work's been focused on understanding how these sorts of systems operate as ecosystems, and particularly where do things get their food, what are the major sources of that, how much food is produced, and how important are these places as refugia for aquatic organisms. And one of the things I thought was really quite interesting when we started working in the Channel Country river systems is that these are incredibly turbid water bodies, not a lot of vegetation, and yet they, despite the very high turbidity, they end up being incredibly productive. There's in the shallow margins of these waterholes and the dry periods, there's very high rates of primary production, of algal production along the edges of these things. Our work is using a range of chemical traces has shown that about 70 to 80% of the biomass, the actual body weight of all the consumers in their fish, turtles, crayfish and so on, is actually derived from that source. So you have these highly productive systems sustaining big populations of aquatic animals, and this is all largely driven by this very productive source of food within the river system. Work that we've done over the last 5 to 10 years in the wet-dry tropics across northern Australia has shown a very, very similar pattern. We find that right across these systems, this is the Flinders River here, again using chemical traces here. This is fish body size. Each one of these dots effectively is a fish. And the line in the middle there represents that those fish have got at least 50% of their bodies derived from that particular source. And so what you should see is, particularly for big fish in these systems, that they're largely growing to those sizes, driven by that particular microscopic source of algae in those systems. And that's a pattern that we see right across these particular systems. Well, of course, what I've talked about is really what these systems look like and operate during the dry times. And, the dry times, there's, a long time between drinks in some of these particular systems. This is an example from the flow record from the Cooper Creek in the Channel Country. The longest no-flow period on record to date has been about 21 months during the 1950s. And these systems then have very, very long dry spells with very little local rain. We know that these systems are exposed to very high rates of evaporation, typically in the order of 2 metres or more than 2 metres a year. And many of the water holes that you work on in these river systems are quite shallow. Many of them are only 2 to 3 metres deep, and many more are much less than that. What we found, particularly in the Channel Country rivers and certainly in most of the northern Murray-Darling Basin, these systems are driven purely by surface water, that there's very little evidence of groundwater coming in and sustaining these systems. And so their persistence in the long term is a consequence of how often they get topped up by those little surface water flows or by big flow events. And that becomes really important to sustaining the physical character of these river systems. One of the questions that's often been asked is, well, how many of these permanent water bodies are there in these systems? This particular study, done in 2009, suggests there's around, in the Lake Eyre Basin, around 830 permanent and semi-permanent water holes. And of that, only about a third have never been dry since white settlement, and we don't really understand whether or not some of those, of course, have been dry well before then. Most of these in the Lake Eyre Basin occur in the Cooper Creek catchment, which has something like 2/3 of all the documented water holes. And if you go to places like the Georgina, there are only about 60 truly permanent water holes in that particular system. The rest are referred to as being annually dry, and that, of course, poses some challenges for fully aquatic organisms. One of the key challenges to these systems, of course, is not only that our climate is dry and variable, but it's also changing. And we know that the projections for most of Australia are for a warmer and drier future. And certainly the projections for these kinds of river systems in the drylands are not that great. This particular analysis in 2007 indicates that evaporation is likely to increase slightly, which will mean that those irregular surface flows in these systems are going to become more and more important, that the average and dry scenarios associated will end up with a reduced frequency of low flows, the less than 1,000 megalitres a day. And again, that's going to have some impact on waterhole persistence and connectivity. And the model data suggests that we'll expect to see an extended period of no flows. And the implication of that is, of course, that those no flow periods may start to exceed the point where some of those more permanent water holes are able to persist over time. And all of that, of course, assumes that during those dry periods, no one is taking water out, extracting water from those water holes for irrigation or domestic supply. Some of the work that our group has done recently as part of an NCAF, a climate adaptation facility project, looking at mapping changes or predicting changes in perenniality. And in this particular case, defining perenniality as really an area that contains water for the whole year except during exceptionally dry periods. So this is the sort of 9 years out of 10. And the way these data have been calculated is by looking at 5 kilometre grids, which is why the dots on there you can't see very well. They're small features in the landscape. Looking at what's basically the proportion of perennial features in the landscape divided by the total area of water features in there. And it may not be terribly easy to see from the background, but these are looking at changes, predicted changes in perenniality to 2085. And largely what you see through most of the dryland regions here, that these are quite substantive reductions in perenniality that are predicted due to climate change, median climate predictions over that particular period of time. On top of that, of course, we have water resource development pressures, and pressures either from direct pumping from individual water holes during dry times or interception of flows during the flood periods. And this, of course, has been a significant change in the way that dryland rivers in the Darling, the Upper Murray-Darling Basin have changed over the last 30 or 40 years. These sorts of developments were thought to be a thing of the past, given that the water planning that we've seen, particularly the development of water plans in Queensland. In the Cooper Creek catchment, some 15 years ago or so, the water plan was developed there, which basically put very strict limits on what development would occur. But you can see that those things had changed when we had changing governments. In 2013, with not the current Queensland government, the one we had last week, changes in government lead to very significant changes in policy. And so with the changing of our last government, the water resource plan of the Cooper Creek was opened up for small-scale development in the upper parts of the catchment. And so some of those protections in the Cooper Creek water resource plan were suddenly removed. And, it seems strange to me, having been out and, with a group of people in the Cooper Creek Basin, fought for and obtained a reasonable level of sustainability for the Cooper Creek and other rivers in the Lake Eyre Basin, found that we were back there again 15 years later, almost having the same meeting all over again. The kinds of things we're talking about in these systems don't sound terribly unreasonable. We're not talking about large-scale developments, building big dams and taking lots of water. And in fact, if you look at these dryland systems, if you were to do some substantive interception of floodplain flows, you might take the tops off some of the big flood events, probably not have too much of an impact on those. But it's really the small-scale development that starts to have an impact. And it's these smaller flood pulses or flow pulses in the system that are quite easy to intercept and retain on farm. These are the kinds of things that have the potential to have a major impact in those systems, because taking out some of these flow pulses does lead to increases in dry spells. And if you look at this old period of the Cooper Creek record, you can imagine that an interception that took out that particular event would have led to a very long extended period of no flow in the system, and the persistence of water holes down through that system would have been compromised. So we're often not talking about very substantive amounts of water when we're talking about development. We're talking about key flow events and the timing of those, which has the potential to do considerable harm. And of course, when you combine all those things, a changing climate, and you look at those sorts of pressures on individual waterholes, what happens, of course, is then during very dry times, we see concentrations of impacts on the few existing waterholes. You will see localised extinction of aquatic species, and of course, the loss of connectivity throughout the system and the opportunity for colonisation and recolonisation, and that, of course, affects populations in the longer term. Now, I've talked so far really about systems that are what we would describe in hydrologic terms as extreme harsh summer intermittent systems, which characterise most of the inland part of Australia. Of course, we have other types of systems in the north which are more predictable, but again, highly intermittent. Ones, for example, in the wet tropics, which are characterised by being more predictable and having a more stable base flow because of rain. But throughout the north too, we have these other systems which have a very stable base flow that's due to groundwater. And there are only a few systems across the north that are characterised by that, but they turn out to be quite important ones. Now, some of the work that our group have done under the Tropical Rivers and Coastal Knowledge Program, this particular study was done, the Daly River Flows and Fish Study, or Fish and Flows Study that was done. Looked at what the environmental risk would be to water resource development in the Daly River. Now, the Daly, of course, is a really interesting river because it is sustained through the dry season by quite substantive amounts of groundwater that underpin that particular river system. And the scenarios that they looked at here were this is a typical year under the flow modelling, so this is the wet season flows here, the natural modelled flows, historic, which is the actual flow, and these dotted lines represent what would happen if all the current entitlements in the Daly River Water Resource Plan were being utilised, and what were considered to be possible future entitlements that might be issued under that plan. Now, when you look at this plot, it's, of course, the thing to note, it's on a logarithmic scale, so these flows are 1,000 times higher than the ones down here. And when you consider that, of course, in terms of annual volumes, we're not really talking about a very large proportion of the mean annual flow. It sounds quite reasonable that the development in this system is only taking a few percent of the mean annual flow. But of course, it is a significant fraction of the dry season flow. Now, the study that was done on that particular system, looking at what were the environmental flow needs of iconic species, species that were important for recreation value, but also species that were of high cultural value in the region. Well, what these analyses showed was that if we go to even the current scenarios, if all the future entitlements were taken, we would double the risk to species like sooty grunter of there being extremely low populations. And so this modelling exercise looked at what was the risk under those different scenarios and concluded that even if the current entitlements were fully used, there was a significant risk to the viability of important species of fish and other animals within that particular system. So just to emphasise it, a lot of these impacts are not talking about major changes to the flow regime in terms of total volume, but talking about subtle changes to the way in which the flow regime operates. This, to my mind, highlights a considerable problem that we have with water management in Australia, and particularly the science challenge in water management in Australia, is that we have a real mismatch in measurement and modelling when we start talking about the water needs for humans and the water needs for the environment. Typically, when we're talking about developing water plans, whether it's for cities or for agricultural water supply, we're only really interested in volumes, and we're really interested in the larger flow events, the big flow events, and small flow events are really not that important. But from an environmental perspective, particularly in these more intermittently flowing streams, it's the low flows and the dry spell duration, all of those low flow parameters of the flow regime that become really quite important. And our gauging network and the models that we use for water resource planning don't need to take those into account terribly well because they're not important for calculating yield. And so we have a fairly poor ability to know exactly and to be able to model and measure what the low flow and no flow scenarios are for most river systems that we're dealing with in the country. And I think this becomes quite a serious challenge for developing environmental flow management. The other key aspect of that, of course, is in these systems, average flow statistics are incredibly misleading. So when we see discussions around developments that talk about changes to the average flow or the mean flow, they're incredibly misleading, and often the case, they're used very deliberately to be misleading. And so it really becomes quite a nonsense to be talking about what particular developments are doing to changing the average flow, because if you look at any long-term flow record of a river in this particular part of the world, the chances of you actually being in an average flow year are fairly small. What that means is that there's a real science challenge here. It's a challenge to how we change the way that we measure and manage our water resources. We need to bring together our conventional understanding of hydrology, the sort of surface water measurements and so on, with other tools, remote sensing tools, distributed logger systems, sensor networks, using groundwater chemistry and other traces to be able to put together what is the low flow story, the hydrology story in those particular systems. Being able to map where permanent water is in the landscape over time is another critical piece of information that we're going to need for these systems. And associated with that, I think we need better deliberative tools. By deliberative tools, we need an opportunity for people to be able to sit around and make decisions about where are the important things in the landscape. What types of habitats are out there and how important are they to society, for environmental means, for cultural means, for economic means indeed. Where are they, how are they connected, how are they going to change with climate? And then the really critical stuff is if we have a limited amount of water, which ones are you going to protect? How many of them? Where are they in the landscape? Those are decisions that can't be made by scientists, but they are decisions that need to be made, and they need to be made in a very consultative, deliberative way, and we don't really have the tools at the moment or the institutions to allow us to do that. One of the other challenges we're dealing with, particularly at the low flow end of the spectrum, and this is one that I'm not going to spend much time on, I was asked to briefly raise it, but there are others in the program today that will talk about this more, is what I'd refer to as a relatively new challenge of co-produced water in the landscape. And when we're looking at operations like coal seam gas, but also dewatering of open cut mines, this now represents a reasonably emerging issue for water management within the drylands. The volumes that we're talking about are often not large when you compare them to the average discharge of an entire river system, but the impacts of several operations discharging into a small river system, the flow volumes that we're talking about do start to become quite significant. There are significant quality concerns associated with the quality of water that's being extracted, and of course now there are often strict requirements in place to treat water before it's discharged. And of course there are concerns with other chemicals that are used in the processing and in the exploration and delivery of those materials. But it's not just about quality concerns, of course, it's about quantity concerns. And, you know, I've heard spoken in a number of forums that dewatered mine sites and water from coal seam gas can be used as, you know, it's going to be an important environmental flow. We can put all this very highly treated water down a river and that'll be good for the environment. Well, those studies really haven't been done. And in highly intermittent systems, putting a trickle of distilled water down into them is not necessarily going to give you a very good environmental outcome. So there are emerging concerns with this and I guess an interesting field for people involved and working in this space for the future. The other side of it, and I was interested to see that there are actually some pamphlets on every chair this morning really illustrating one of the examples of this, is that there have to be examples of using co-produced water for other things. What's the opportunity there to use that water, not to necessarily expand on a whole range of other commercial operations, but potentially to take the pressure off some of our other freshwater and groundwater reserves. And so I think that this is a real opportunity on a small scale into the future. One of the reasons I say this is a new challenge too, it's worth noting that co-produced water from mining was never really captured under the water resource plans and under the Water Act. And so these operations in the past have traditionally operated outside of the broader sphere of water management. And it's been one of the calls of the National Water Commission is how do we bring mining firmly into the sort of water management debate. Now, I've spoken largely about the dry times of the year. I also wanted to be able to talk about some of the other extremes, the wetter parts of the hydrological cycle. And one of the key things, of course, about the systems that we're dealing with is that many of them have vast floodplains and many of them experience quite spectacular floods. These are some photos of two events in the Cooper Creek system. The first one, I think, covered nearly 14,000 square kilometres as it moved down through that particular river system over months. The second one there on Goyder's Lagoon. So that these really large events are another characteristic feature of the way in which these systems operate. We know from our work in the Cooper Creek system that these big events are incredibly important, that they're associated with an enormous boom of production, and not only a boom of production, pastoral production in the following months, but also a boom of production for wildlife in the region. And, you know, our estimates of primary production, aquatic primary production on the floodplain during that March 2000 event meant that if you measure the amount of production and scale it up for the entire flood, 1 day of production during that flood event was equivalent to about 80 years of production in all of the waterholes during the dry time. So the level of subsidy that these big events can provide for aquatic animals and also for the surrounding landscape is enormous. We've worked over the last 5 or 6 years studying very similar issues in northern Australia. We've looked at these sorts of processes in river systems in the monsoonal tropics. And we find a very, very similar story, that many species derive much of their growth and biomass, most of their body tissue, is grown during a very short window of time by feeding on the floodplain. The graph that I put in here is just an example of one of the species. This is a catfish. These are, again, chemical signatures that are embedded in their body tissues. We can characterise whether they got those from the river, or whether they got it from the sea, or whether they got it from the floodplain. And if you do the sums, about 80% of the biomass of this particular fish caught on the floodplain during the wet season has been derived from feeding on the floodplain. And we find that through a whole range of different fish, big fish in particular, that are in the river, so they're river fish, but they're getting most of their growth by feeding on the floodplain in a 2 to 3 month window of time. In the case of this is for the Mitchell River, in the case of that. We find other species that will move up from the estuary and onto the floodplain and put all of that growth into reproduction. So basically their population viability is entirely dependent on coming into the system, feeding on the floodplain and then moving back out and spawning somewhere else. And so these are enormous landscape subsidies that these systems get. So when we think of the river system, it's not just about the river channel, that these systems are being subsidised by very large movements of materials, particularly associated with the floodplain. And look at another iconic species, the Barramundi, and this is, again, data from the that we looked at for the Mitchell River, we calculated that 30 to 40% of the growth of fish that we caught in the Mitchell River were derived from that feeding just on those short flood periods. And we know from other work, this is work Julie Robbins and others have done, that these data are for the Fitzroy in Queensland, but the same pattern has been found across northern Australia. Very, very tight links between the total production of Barramundi and a bunch of other species and the magnitude of the flood events that occur in any one year. Now, this relationship then between these flood events and key features of these systems is one that we've been quite interested in exploring. This is some recent work that's published in the journal Ecology just only a month or so ago, where we looked at data sets for right across northern Australia, the ones that we could get decent data for, and also for a range of rivers in South America. We tried to get data for South Africa as well, for Africa as well, but the data sets are not as good for there. And really trying to explore what is it about the flooding regime that we can describe as being important. We think of the floods as being important because there's a lot of interannual variability and there's variability in the timing of when they occur. There's variability in the size of a flood from year to year. And so what we tried to do in this study was really characterise a new term from those data, which we've referred to as rhythmicity. And rhythmicity basically says that if you have a river system where you have a flood of the same size, of the same magnitude and duration, and it occurred on the same time of year every year for 100 years, then that would be a highly rhythmic system. If you have an equal probability of getting a flood of any size on any time of the year, then that would be completely arrhythmic. You can liken it to your heart rate, if you like, whether you have a highly erratic heartbeat or a really strong and pulsed one. And these are some examples of the data sets of a Murchison River in West Australia, which has a very arrhythmic pattern. This is one of the ones we've looked at in the tropical parts of South America, which has a very rhythmic flow regime. And you sort of say, well, all right, we can characterise river systems around this is for the tropical parts of the world, but basically you can show that when you look at all those systems, the Australian ones, the red ones over here, tend to be at the sort of noisier end of the spectrum, which is what we'd predict. And if you look at those, plotted in this way, the big circles are ones that are highly rhythmic, the small ones are ones that are not that rhythmic. As I said, the Australian ones tend to fit out in the sort of the noisier part of the spectrum. And the other important thing is you can still see quite a lot of variability across Australia in terms of how these systems are behaving. So why is that all important? Well, what we did in that study was started to look at what the relationships with rhythmicity is to other key features of the landscape. And I put up a couple of plots here. This one here is looking at the relationship between the rhythm of the flood regime and floodplain. This is net primary production on the floodplains. This one here is fish diversity plotted against rhythm. And you see, even though the Australian systems are sitting at the sort of extreme end of all this, there's still some significant relationships between that overall pattern of rhythmicity and things like biodiversity and things like productivity. Now, what's all that mean? It does mean that there are very long-term implications if we start changing the rhythmic pattern of these flood events. And we can do that through changing climate or through water resource development. We have the ability, of course, to change rivers from being highly arrhythmic to more rhythmic ones, and also the reverse. And of course, this does become important because the debate in Northern Australia in particular has shifted quite strongly into great interest in significantly developing the water resources of the north. And we've seen some proposals already for quite substantive projects. They've not been approved, I might add, but the substantive projects to divert water in these river systems. The one on the top right there, many of you will know, sounds again a very reasonable proposal, the plan to develop 10% of, again, the annual average flow, but noting that that could be all of the flow in 8 years out of 10. But these sorts of projects do have the potential to significantly alter flow regimes in those systems. The other interesting part of that, of course, is if we're talking about developing these sorts of resources, we have to be aware that to put in infrastructure, whether it be weirs or levees or culvert crossings, that is going to have substantive influences on these systems. We unusually for some of these river systems in the north, they have a very high proportion of their fish species that are migratory, that need to use extensive parts of the river network. And in the case of the Flinders, it's 30%. Over 30% of the fish that are in there actually make use of the actual river system throughout. And so even small weirs that are put there across the river, road crossings and so on, have the potential as barriers to impede the movement of fish and ultimately affect populations and productivity in those systems. And of course, there are other associated land management issues with these systems as well. We're not just talking about water quantity issues, there are other associated issues of land vulnerability. This is some work that one of my colleagues has done in the Mitchell River, looking at alluvial gully erosion, and this is an interesting type of gully erosion for those of you who are interested in dirt, but it's interesting in the sense that it's not one that's been relatively well studied or well understood as to what causes it and what happens with it. But these gullies effectively start to migrate up from riparian areas and, like a cancer, just every wet season take out more and more of the landscape. And as you can see, they're quite significant in their potential loss of soil. And we know that that has a big impact on sedimentation of water holes and on sediment delivery to the coastal zone. But it also results in quite a lot of potential for loss of roads, loss of infrastructure. These are very difficult erosion heads to control in the landscape. Thank you. And I'll finish then as I wrap up with what are some of the other challenges that we're faced with. And I think one of the key ones, of course, are institutional, as they always tend to be. We do have a very short-term cycle of government interest in natural resource management and in a whole range of other things. And certainly in the water space, the moment the drought broke, the government's interest in water declined considerably. We've seen a massive reduction in investment in both management and R&D to look at water issues in Australia. The water reform process, which began under the National Water Initiative, is largely considered to be the work's all done, so we don't need to really focus too much more effort on that. Murray-Darling Basin plan's been signed off, so the job's done. And yet we know that there are significant issues looming. And we've seen, of course, during that period, over the last decade or so, the demise of Land and Water Australia, one of the key corporations that was funding a lot of R&D on land and water issues. And more recently, of course, the demise of the National Water Commission, all herald a growing disinterest of government in these sorts of water issues. And so we only have to wait, I guess, for the next drought for those interests to be renewed. What I'd like to finish with, though, is really what I believe are some of the real challenges that we've been dealing with institutionally. And that is that if you look up before the National Water Reform, the COAG reforms of the 90s, that water management systems up until that time had been pretty much focused on delivering water to support economic outcomes, either coming up with plans to deliver water for towns and cities or delivering water for agricultural development. And so water planning, the delivery of entitlements and the allocation of water was really with a single purpose in mind, to be able to develop that, use it for consumptive use. But we've seen over the last decade or so a real change in community expectation in the way that we manage our water resources. So now water management has to meet a whole range of multiple and often competing objectives within set environmental limits. There are complex arrangements that are in place that demand that recognition of the interdependency of those things, taking into account the variable nature of the water resource and issues of what to do when there are times of scarcity. We've also seen under the National Reform Agenda that the ability for now that we've separated water and property entitlements, the ability for people to move water, to trade water between different uses. And of course there's been at the same time much greater public interest in how those decisions are being made in terms of delivering water to those various competing needs, and a great interest in actually seeing some of the monitoring and evaluation of whether it's working or not. And so we see now that what we're dealing with is now we've got the similar sort of water planning process doing its usual thing, but now we have an environmental water holder. In fact, we have more than one of those, depending on which states you're looking at. So we have the ability to move water between different consumptive uses for the environment. There was at one stage considerable interest and discussion in the creation of an Indigenous strategic reserve in water planning, and certainly the allocation of water for cultural purposes being used as well. And really the aim now, of course, is to deliver on environmental, economic and social outcomes. But of course, as we move into the future, there's going to be a need, I think, for more deliberative tools to be able to optimise for those investments. And if you're going to meet those objectives, those multiple objectives, we need a much more evidence-based process for doing that. We need tools that are able to link the social and these ecological systems. And importantly, we need to bring water management back into the broader natural resource management. This was a finding of the 2011 biennial assessment of the National Water Commission. That's one of the things that's happened over the last decade or so, is that we've really started to manage water all on its own as if it can be done completely independent of a lot of the other natural resource management issues. And so if we're looking at a future way of managing water resources, it really needs to be much more embedded in our broader NRM planning, much more strongly linked to our other social and economic activities in terms of regional development agendas. And only then will we be able to deliver on those multiple outcomes. I will say too that this needs to be seen as a very strongly adaptive process and there needs to be robust monitoring and evaluation. And one of the things we've also witnessed over the last decade or so is an extreme reluctance of government to invest in monitoring, to actually assess whether or not any of these interventions are working or not. And it's a really important thing, I think, to highlight the need for that ongoing investment in monitoring and assessment. And with that, I finish. I've said to the organisers, if there's time, I'll play you a little 3-minute video, but I'll leave that to my honourable chair here.
I think there is time. Your timing's been excellent, Stuart. So let's roll the video.
Hopefully we'll give you an insight on what future water management may be if we can fire it up at the back.
Tell you what, I've got a dream, Roy, and it concerns this map behind me. We've tried to get this into the show, but producers won't let us. The channel here at 7 have been dead against this topic, but we've got a couple of hours now. Let's settle back and really give this one a workout. And it concerns the dream that I've had for years now of turning bludgeoning rivers inland. Sure, we're not scientists. We don't know what we're talking about here, but it just makes common, plain sense. Roy, you've been working on this map for months. Where do you want to start, bro? Which river gets on your goat the most?
The river that shits me the most is the Mitchell River here.
Yeah.
I think roughly 500 million tonnes of water, litres of water, 500 million, count them, it'll take it forever, flow into the Gulf of Carpentaria every hour.
Every hour?
Every hour. 500 million litres of water every hour. Now, the Romans, I don't know how many years ago they were kicking around, but let's say it's about 2 BC or 200 BC or even earlier. Yes. They go back a long way. Yes. They had aqueducts.
Aqueducts.
That's not hard.
No.
It's not hard. No. It's not as if we've got a mountainous country or not.
No.
Wouldn't it be possible to build an aqueduct straight down here? Delivering 500. Is that hard to get your head around? I don't think so. No. And there are other bloody rivers up here that you can pipe down. There's no reason why you couldn't take every bloody river into here, creating an inland sea, creating clouds.
What a brilliant idea.
Clouds!
Yeah.
I mean, two things. We do this and we encourage everyone in Australia to use as much water as they bloody well can. Get it out there so that evaporation will create clouds and it will return to us tenfold, HG, tenfold.
And the jobs, Roy. Just think of the jobs. Jobs. I'll tell you one that never gets mentioned. It is here in South Australia in Adelaide, the Putawalong Creek. I can see it. Just forever. It just tips millions and millions of megalitre straight out of here into St Vincent's Gulf. And if we could turn that just with a pump and a bit of PVC pipe, imagine what it'd grow. Rock melons and kumquats and quince and turns and everything like that. It'd be an absolute garden of Eden. A garden of Eden there in the driest state, in the driest continent, Roy. And that's all just out of the Putawalong.
Look, the dream I have is that all this is cotton growing here. Cotton. We could clothe the world.
And next week in this section, we'll be tackling that vexed question of dragging icebergs from Antarctica. The great Australian bite. Bring them here and running the water into the continent of Australia. There'll be more dump right after this.
So thank you very much.
Well, that was a great presentation. A hard act to follow, and very difficult to get your mind back on something serious. But we do have a few minutes now, in fact, about 12 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there are going to be some arising out of either the video or the main presentation. And there's one right up the back there now, so could we have the microphone there, please?
Gus White, I'm a landholder actually on the Range River, which comes off the Darling. Stuart, really interested to hear you look to connect watershed management, floodplain management, and certainly in-stream management when the rivers are dry, because that's what we see a fair bit of. So I guess what sorts of monitoring recommendations might you make to rangeland landholders like myself for management of those sort of sensitive areas?
Yeah, one of the key things that we've been recommending, particularly for the Northern Basin, is that exercise of identifying where are key places in the landscape is going to be really important, because in the future we're not going to have enough water to connect all of those things with the right frequency and the right time. So I think, first of all, there's an exercise to be done about identifying where are the places and get broad agreement that, yes, they are the critical places. And then what is it that you can do to offset some of these impacts? And certainly there's a lot you can do. Broader natural resource management, controlling stock access to critical places, reducing feral animals, a whole range of things that may be means of adaptation responses to reduced availability. I think one of the key things we can do to those places in drier times is to remove some of the other stresses, and that'll be a key adaptation response. But I certainly agree, there are, if you were to sum up what are the total sort of range of things we could do to get better environmental outcomes, pulling the water lever is only one of those. And at the moment, the current basin plan is focused very heavily on that. That's what the Water Act requires them to do. It's time to really bring that into that broader NRM context. And so, I think what are the things you can do? I think that's a big question, and there's certainly lots of opportunity to explore what ways make sense and what works for people living there and using the land, as well as getting a good environmental outcome.
Thanks, Stuart.
Another question?
Thanks, Professor, for the lecture. It was very interesting. What I'm interested in is the soil loss and land erosion, and you touched on it in one of your last slides. To what extent do you think it has contributed to the current threats there are in the river systems in Australia?
One of our students did some work in the Mitchell River looking at taking historical, the aerial photos right back to war times, and mapping those gullies, the alluvial gullies in the Mitchell River system over time, and then by extrapolating back, looking at the growth, trying to estimate at what time and since European settlement did those occur. A lot of them seem to coincide with a period where there's a very high stocking rate of cattle in the Cape York at that time, and the suggestion is that some of those erosion heads have just started because of critical nick points in riparian areas, and they've just eroded up from that. So alluvial gully erosion, the causes of that and the triggers for that, I think the ones that we're seeing in the Mitchell started a long time ago, and they're certainly very difficult to stop. In other ones, they're caused by just changing vegetation patterns. Sometimes they're caused by downstream changes to the channel network, people straightening channels, cutting off anabranches and so on. So some of the instability, particularly on the coastal systems, is caused by completely different factors. But one of the things I will say, a lot of the evidence, particularly for the coastal systems on the east coast of Australia, is that most of the sediment that's coming out of river systems into our coastal environment is from gully and channel erosion. These are not broad land management problems, they're riparian stream problems.
Wal Whaley.
Wal Whaley from UNE Armidale. I'd like to take you back to the picture you put on about right at the beginning about all the water in the world in America. How does our great Australian, the Artesian Basin, fit into that context?
Yeah. So if you remember, there were three balls of water there. The second size ball of water includes all of the fresh water, and that includes water in ice and in groundwater as well. So the second size ball is all of the fresh water in the world, but it's separating out the groundwater. I think that's been done, but not in that graphics. But certainly the artesian water would be a part of that, and it wasn't counted in the surface water part of that equation here.
There's a question up the back, or about the halfway. Could you put your hand up, please?
Yeah, Andrew Drysdale from the Rangelands Alliance. Just your last comment there concerned me before the previous one, where you said sediments aren't a land management issue; they're a gully erosion issue. I challenge that to say, sure, the sediments may not be carried in the water, but surely leaving the water in the landscape will reduce the amount of water running down gullies and eroding gullies.
Yeah, so you're right, and I take your point, stand corrected. That when I say it's not a land management problem, what we're seeing a lot in response to addressing sediment issues in the coastal zone is a perception that we can do that by just encouraging BMP on farms and controlling runoff from the properties themselves. What we're not seeing is the investment in the river network that's going on. And what we've found is in many of the coastal rivers, about 80% of the sediment load that actually gets into the river and out to sea is coming from the channel network itself. And it is a land management problem. You did right. But often it's not the responsibility of individual landowners. And what we see often too is an individual landowner has very little power to do anything about the erosion problems in the channel network adjacent or flowing through their property. All they can do often is to do things to externalise the problem downstream, put up a levee and control the erosion on their property. So I take your point, it is a land management problem, but it's often outside of the realm that you can deal with at a property scale.
Question down the front here. Excuse me. Don Burnside.
Thanks, Stuart. Stuart, you referred to the erroneous use of average flows and the fact that that information can be used for, or is misleading and also used deliberately for that purpose. It's very hard for ordinary people to understand the information that you're presenting in terms of this high variability, the importance of the low flows and all that sort of stuff. I mean, how can we present that information into the public domain in a way that the wider population understands it, and then that can influence the policy debate?
Yeah, I think we sort of grossly overestimate the level of water literacy. The things about water that people understand. That it weighs a lot. That you can't simply dig a channel and have it run from the north to the south. It doesn't flow downhill on the map. All of those really basic things, and it's incredible just how much we expect the general public to understand the very basic sort of things. The things with the sort of average statistics, though, I think, again, it's one of those areas where they are concepts that we take for granted but are difficult to explain. I mean, one analogy might be that, the average oxygen concentration that's currently in the room is probably 20%. But if I said to you for the next 20 minutes there'll be 0, and then for the rest of it it'll be 100, many of you in here won't be terribly pleased with that. So I guess it's a way of how do we express those things about averages and why averages don't make sense if you're trying to sustain something in the longer term. And certainly, I've seen this in many examples about the minister's announcement about the Cooper Creek Water Plan was, look, all these developments are only going to change the flow into, South Australia by 0.02%, the average flow. So these terms are being used very deliberately, very selectively, I think, to confuse the issue. And I think it's time to sort of start bringing the debate as to what are better ways of describing these sorts of systems.
We'll make this our last question. I'm sorry, George at the back got his hand up first.
Thanks.
We'll have to make this the last question.
Okay. George Wilson. My question's actually related to the last one, and that is, how does this information flow into, to use a pun, the establishment of a population policy for Australia? Because I think there's huge confusion in this area at the moment. And yet it would appear to me that the future of our inland cities, such as Canberra, where I live, is really limited by the availability of fresh water, and yet this isn't on the agenda at all. Canberra's headed for 400,000 or 500,000 people, with no suggestion that that's going to be the limit.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in one of the reviews under the National Water Commission did looking at, one of the strategies that cities can have in Australia is to really diversify your water portfolio and make sure that you've got water supplies that are independent of rainfall. And most cities in Australia, like it or not, have moved to those forms. They've got desalination plants, and you look around the world, coastal cities are going to be doing more and more of that. So that's the solution potentially for coastal cities in Australia where most people live. But when you look at regional centres right across Australia, they're incredibly vulnerable at the moment because they don't have the opportunities to do that. They don't have opportunities to look at other forms of water. In dry times, the communities are dependent still on agriculture, but then you have the towns are competing with the agricultural water supply for water as well. So you're right. I think that's one of the greatest challenges we have in Australia is not that, not 90% of the people in the country will have access to water. It's because they live on the coast. But there are vast areas in Australia, regional and remote communities in particular, where water availability, water security, is at extreme levels, and coming up with solutions for that's going to be very, very difficult, I think. And moving water around, if you look at the proposals to do it, proposals to move water from the northwest of Australia to the city of Perth by pipe or canal, you're looking at $20 a kilolitre to do it. You can desalinate seawater for less than $2. So the cost of these things are going to be really prohibitive.